heard Stoa before?
Mm-hmm.
Something about a room. What is it, Stoa? Taking to the porch. I'll be okay.
Hi, how are you?
So what are we going to be talking about today?
Today we're going to be doing a hot seat.
I began to understand their side.
Watch people think out loud. Watch the people you respect actually think out loud.
Here's what colloquia allowed me to do. It allowed me to see myself as a philosopher for the first time ever.
You begin from this place of, it's not my position that matters, right? It's representing the other one that matters most.
And then we would challenge him as a group. But then we would hear him reverse the rules.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning into the Stoa podcast. My name is Sidhu. So what I'm going to do in the beginning of these videos is I'm going to give you guys just a brief introduction as to what the Stoa is, what topic we've selected, what the format is, and then the general rules that we operate from. What I'm doing now is traditionally done in a classroom setting with a moderator, but in this podcasting format, I'm going to communicate the guidelines ahead of time so that you guys understand where we're operating from. So first, the Stoa is essentially a place to play with ideas. What we do is we identify controversial issues that are difficult to discuss in today's world, and we identify the polar ends of them. Now, by polar ends, I don't mean the extreme ends of the conversation, but what I mean is where people tend to lie and where the argument tends to rest on. What we do then is we steel man both of those sides. So for those who are unfamiliar, steel manning is the opposite of straw manning. Straw manning is a logical fallacy that attempts to belittle an argument and in the attempt to win, while steel manning is an attempt to articulate the strongest conceivable argument for that given position. So much so that somebody that holds that position would agree that, yes, this is what I think. What happens when you embody the steel man is you begin to understand the argument, or it's somebody that holds that argument as an individual with a set of rationale that allowed them to arrive at a given conclusion. But it also just shows you the limitations of your own understanding as to what that position entails. So I'll go over the rules first. First is no ad hominems. That means you don't attack the person, you attack the argument, or you challenge the argument. The second is adherence to the steel man. So again, when you're communicating a position, and you'll see it today, communicate it in its strongest conceivable form. And that means your version of what that strongest conceivable form looks like. The third is to maintain anonymity. What I mean by that is do not give disclaimers as to what your actual position is. Leave it a mystery. So hopefully throughout this conversation, as you guys will find, you won't be able to identify what any of us actually think. The purpose of that is to create an environment, again, where we're playing with ideas. You extract the idea from yourself, you put it in the middle, and you allow it to participate in this model. And then finally, no monologues, meaning that we won't go on rants, hopefully, for however long. The topic we've selected today is the utility of religion. So is religion beneficial to society? Has it historically been beneficial? Is it still relevant today? Or is it a detriment to progress? Is it an outdated belief system that was used by people to essentially enslave the minds of the people around them? Now, we'll lay out what our given sides are, but in the beginning, we attempt to identify at least what that steel man portion conventionally entails. The format is going to be a red team, blue team. So what that means is the red will steel man one side of the argument and the blue will steel man the other side of the argument. And you guys will hear what those positions look like. So thank you for tuning in and let us know what you guys think. Okay, what's up everybody?
How you doing?
Welcome to the first official recording of an actual Stoa. So I've already laid out the topic itself. It's a red team, blue team. We have Jonathan Karten on the red. We have Alex Horn on the red.
Good to be here.
We got Prakhar Gupta on the blue.
Represent!
And then we got Sid on the mic.
I love how we naturally delegated it according to Hinduism versus Judaism.
That was not natural at all.
It's killing.
That was premeditated.
You have a
to
eugenic idea
represent
in your
the
head.
circumcised at the table.
Anything the Jews want to do is automatically natural.
Anybody
True,
the rabbi
true.
touched is on that side of the table.
He didn't
Anyway.
touch. It was a lip to phallus that was different.
Okay, so let's just start with brief introductions. Let's start with Jonathan.
Hello. I'm Jonathan Karten. I'm playing for one half of the Jewish side of the board. And what my background? What did I do in the past?
You're a student at
I'm
Columbia.
a student at Columbia. I'm an Air Force veteran. Work with the Israeli consulate, and I enjoy talking about bullshit with these knuckleheads.
All right, I'm Alex. I'm the other half of this red
Ashkenazi.
team of Ashkenazi Jews. I'm the current president of Colloquia,
Here.
the student branch of Stoa at Columbia. I'm originally from Philadelphia, and I'm a creative writing major. So if this Stoa thing doesn't work out, I look forward to majoring in pre-unemployment.
You're homeless regardless of what happens.
Sure, I got a nice couch for you. Don't worry about it.
I don't think I can top that. My name is Prakhar Gupta. I'm the guy with the Indian accent, in case somebody's confused through the Stoa. I am infamously the host of PG Radio. If somebody's listening from India, they know me. I study psychology and economics, but I use it to approach philosophy and politics, but I do it sideways. Does that make sense?
No, sure.
Upside down,
for
left,
sure.
right.
Smiling
For sure.
up.
Yeah.
As much sense as anything you say.
Right, and I was
Get 'em.
formerly a part of Colloquia, and now only high investment can beget my attention at Colloquia, like Alex recently put it.
We call him the bandwagon.
Yeah. He comes out if he's in charge. Otherwise, doesn't like sitting in the back.
So my name is Perry Sidhu. I'm also a student at Columbia. I'm the former president of Colloquia. Alex usurped my position.
Yeah,
and,
well.
it was a really ugly coup.
Coup.
Yeah, but
He was like
It was ugly no matter what you call it. Knife in the back and
No. For
everything.
you guys that are listening and not watching the video, the person speaking just now is absolutely beautiful. I disagree with everything that was just said. I got you, bro.
I study philosophy because I want to propagate evil in a way that's digestible to
You
people.
want to be more than just a pretty face.
Yeah,
he wants to be
Yeah.
Mojo Jojo.
I want to be menacing. Mojo Jojo. I want to be transgender. Hey, Mojo Jojo was transgender. Can you believe that?
No.
Whoa. Go
No.
back.
No.
Elaborate.
No, it was him. Do you remember him on Powerpuff Girls? The red.
Oh, Mojo Jojo's a monkey.
The Mojo
Yeah,
Jojo is the
yeah,
monkey.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because
With the
him
brain.
was not delivering evil in a digestible way at all. Mojo Jojo was. You couldn't make sense of his evil. With fucking him,
Do
that
you
was
guys
just dark
remember
shit.
cow chicken cow?
Somewhat.
So you know like the little like devil, the red devil with the big hiney, like the red hiney.
Oh yeah.
Also, talking about
Okay,
cartoon
Powerpuff
transgenderism.
Girls. Let's make a beautiful segue into the utility of religion.
And everything nice.
The utility of the Powerpuff Girls. So what we're going to do is we're going to lay out what our positions look like really quick, just so you guys have a rough idea. This is typically what we do before every Stoa, just so each side has an idea of what their steelman sort of looks like. We're going to flip a coin.
Oh, we have the lovely Veronica, who's come all the way from Berlin just to flip this coin, and then she leaves back immediately.
The coin fell.
The coin has
You had one job, Veronica, one job.
Okay.
All right.
Sure.
One of us need to
Wait.
call.
What is heads? What is tails?
Alex, call.
Heads.
Heads we argue.
Heads we get to pick.
Okay, heads, you get the picture.
Oh,
Yep.
yeah.
No. Just do it. Just use it.
And the coin fell again.
It's tails.
It's
Oh my
tails.
god, Pig, we're in a relationship. You can't just be doing
Hey, let's defend religion.
Okay. Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, for sure.
So
That's my side.
our side is going to look something like religion has had immense utility for people throughout history. Specifically during the darkest moments of the human experience, religion is a way to give people comfort, to let people kind of like suspend their concerns to a higher power, to orient themselves around something that's bigger than them, to have a figure, whatever God that might be, to hold you accountable. It's a binding cultural narrative. It allows people to have at least this cohesive way which they participate in society. It instills morals, ethics, and an ethos that's consistent across groups. And the more the religion expands, the more people fall into this central narrative binding them together.
You totally had that prepared. That's not fair.
No, that's on the top of the dome, bro.
All right, if I can.
No. Can I answer
sure.
that?
Yeah.
Okay. My idea as to why religion is important has to do with what the evolution of epistemology looks like, and the general idea being that truth evolves in nature as we acquire more means of assessing truth. And since the Enlightenment, since Descartes' ultimate skeptical approach to the idea of what is truth, we were not solidly in a position to describe truth as what it is, but how you must behave in accordance with something. We weren't narrowing down on what an item, what an object, what an event is, but how you must behave was the more prominent version of truth. And to create a meme in the Dawkins sense, so binding and so brilliantly laid out with a collection, with a library of truths that spoke not to what it is, but in a more metaphorical sense, to what you must do, is what the job of religion has been for the longest possible time. It's what we think of as wrong or false or dishonest or intellectually inaccurate in religion is basically a truth coded with lies. It's a meta truth. And that is the importance of religion.
Alex, can you translate that to English real quick? I understand a word.
Well, I want to give our own points, and I think we'll speak to that as we go on. But I think what I drew from that mess of
memes involved.
of Columbia philosophy terms would probably be that it's very important when we're having this conversation to define exactly what religion is, because as we understand, religion has changed extremely over time. And I think that many of the positive things you're drawing from religion no longer necessarily apply, because you're including a lot of cultural knowledge, a lot of philosophical knowledge, a lot of family values that may have been included in religion thousands of years ago, but don't necessarily have a tie to the supernatural in and of themselves. And I think that's the element that when people talk about the utility of religion, we really need to get down to, is the supernatural element, the idea of faith, the idea of believing things without any particular fact beyond them.
So is that how we're codifying religion, just to be clear? Just the supernatural nature of religion, not the necessarily cultural ramifications.
It can be ambiguous, but let's start with the most identifiable religion. So we could just focus on the Abrahamic text initially.
Okay.
All right, so going into the Abrahamic text, most of the bloodiest wars in human history and in Western history certainly have been fought over religious hatreds. That has been, throughout history, the Crusades. We see that to this day, the basis of that with things like the Troubles in Ireland to, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the Middle East.
Even to the wars in Syria right now between the Sunnis and the Shiites, the wars with Rohingya.
I don't think it's necessarily fair to lay the blame for those things entirely on religion, the same way that you can't, give those very positive benefits entirely to religion. You can't lay the negatives on them entirely either. But I would say that if we're talking about the utility of religion, the fact is people have different religions. It's not something that just brings people together. It's also something that divides. And so the dividing nature of religion, where people believe very strongly these arbitrary things, essentially arbitrary things because of their cultural identity, and that keeps these differences and divisions of people alive between the generations, I think that's the greatest harm and the greatest challenge to the utility of religion.
I think it incorporates with that sense of xenophobia as well. Because if we just had, let's say, for example, one unifying global religion, we are all considering each other's in-groups, wouldn't that be a much more habitable place to be? The fact that we have to have developed this separately, you can understand and justify evolutionarily speaking. But today, in terms of whether it has utility to us, we don't really need to believe in a higher power to be kind to one another. And in essence, if that's the case, and we can take that as a presupposed truth, then the only thing that religion is giving us is the dividing factors. Just to allow,
Okay. So let's start with one of the points that you guys brought up, right? Now, if we were to remove religion, I would argue that, one, we are religious thinkers. We think in religious terms. We think in narratives. And we think of these long, broad, extending mythological narratives that are actually pretty consistent in the human condition. You can call it the collective unconscious. But these narratives, like Prakhar was saying, in, I guess, more English, they codify information that's actually very useful to us. One, from understanding our past and our history, but also how to move forward, how to move collectively, and then prevent us from doing certain things that may seem outdated and unnecessary now as far as technology is concerned, but especially back then had a huge impact. So my first question to you guys is, one, the alternative seems to be that we'll replace religion with science, right? But I would argue that that is in the direct opposite direction from how human beings naturally operate. And most people are not scientifically fluent. So what do you say, if there was a vacuum in religion, how do you begin there?
Can we just understand the question? You're saying that if there's a vacuum in religion, then how do we justify it with science?
No, what do you replace it with? One example is science. I've heard Sam Harris argue that many, many times.
If I can respond directly to that, I think that you're giving religion too much credit. For the vast majority of Western history, and if you look throughout Europe, for example, there have been two kinds of the supernatural that have been believed, that have been present in that culture, right? There's been the supernatural that is believed to be literally true, your source of worship. So in, post-Christian Europe, that was Christianity. And there was also the supernatural that was believed to not be true, which was mythology, folk tales, storytelling. Paganism. Even in Christian Europe, in paganism, there was a huge divide, right, of the folk religion that the people practiced, and may have had some level of belief in, but that was their storytelling, their philosophy, where they got their morals from. And then kind of the higher, the people who actually went to the temple of Jupiter and worshipped Zeus. there's a division there. So I think that when we're attacking religion, there's no need to get rid of mythology and storytelling, because the power of those things doesn't rely, the reason that the story of Jack and the Beanstalk survived for hundreds of years isn't because anybody literally believed Jack to be true, anybody
Jack
was
is not true.
I'm sorry to disappoint you. No one was praying to the giant except for maybe Johnny. He's kind of a giant. But I'd say that I don't think we need to replace it with anything, because I think what we're removing is mainly the harmful element. We're removing the literal belief that these things are absolutely true, that they're dogma that must be obeyed, and that if someone else denies them, they are challenging my identity and my meaning. Right. And what we're leaving is still the ability to view our lives in narratives, but taking away that element of literal truth.
And let me go one step further. I think that it's not only they don't have to replace it with something. The fact that we don't understand to begin with might be the creation for what we say is religion, the God of gaps theory. So, okay, I don't know why the sun rises in the morning and goes in the evening. There must be some actor that's doing that. That is the God of the sun. Why does the river overflow in the Nile twice every year and let that give us crops? It's the God of the river Nile. So I think that as long as we're able to be uncomfortable with not knowing, we can actually have these honest conversations that will progress us forward. If we just say, hey, no, that we have a solution, it's God to this. No, there's another solution, it's God to that. Then there's no reason to progress forward, because we have already the answer. Whether it's true or not, just believe in it, have faith.
So I think Jonathan, you did justice to making what I would have said to Alex in return. Is that when you spoke about the middle centuries in Europe having two different kinds of definitions of divine, it wasn't that divine was manufactured. It is that the divine is present. And even now, Jonathan, and the way it's present is we still do not understand what breathes bloody life into people. And I'm not saying attributed to a supernatural, omnipotent, omniscient being in the sky who gave you. But the fact of the matter is to really understand, especially when we do not have a concept of what is to not, when we do not know what to do with things we don't understand, we need a very safe blanket around that concept that hopefully will solve other purposes as well. And that speaks to the other half of what you said, which is that nobody literally believes in Jack and the Beanstalk, but that story is still continued. But Jack and the Beanstalk does not serve the purpose of keeping people together or keeping people healthily in a society together, removing friction, creating laws. You have to embed an element of belief to give life to those ideas buried within the matrix. And in all fairness, I do not think you can create a vacuum of something as efficient an idea as religion that sort of dictates or that sort of proxies for our otherwise very frictious ethnic differences. You cannot create a meme as we haven't been able to. That's why religion still continues to survive. And I know I'm touching upon the naturalistic fallacy, but it's evident.
Let me just expand on that really quick. The God of the gaps idea, yes. So Neil deGrasse Tyson has that famous quote that if you're defining God by what we don't understand, it's an ever decreasing space, right? But as far as codifying information, it's not just information blanket, right? Like how lightning works or where rain comes from. It's more so morals and ethics, right? How do we participate with each other? And what Prakhar brought up about the vacuum that's left over is, it was a significant question that I posed earlier. And if I didn't make that clear, that's what I was pointing to, is if religion was left out, right? Now, where do you derive these morals and ethics from? Because I would also argue that people, it's not necessarily inherent to people, right? We formulate tribes, we create small communities, and then we create an oppositional other, and we live almost in relationship to this other. The less we understand them, the less commonalities that we have, the more likely we are to elicit combat, right? Steal resources or just take over their land. Right. Now, what religion, I think, attempted to do, right, was codify this manner of being, right, where now everybody is subordinated to this conception of God, right? This ideal that they can all collectively pursue and held responsible to, right? So I would extend that question one more time. What do you do with the vacuum that's left over, and where would we derive morals and ethical behavior from?
So, you want? So essentially, I think the reason why you have this outcome where we have the in-group and the out-group, and the reason why I guess religion comes to that point is because as individuals, we constantly are trying to check how are we doing. we try to progress. So I say something, I look for your facial reaction, and based on that, I subconsciously modify my action. So if that's the way it works on an individual level, it also works that way on a collective level. So naturally speaking, there will always be some mechanism that will fill up for that gap, creating for a pseudo-religion. Look at the United States now. You have the higher and higher levels of atheism, lower and lower levels of faith of like classical religion, and you have replacements, whether it's tailgating and supporting, the Dodgers or the Giants, or whether it's being in a fan club for 90210 or whatever the other,
or more serious things, patriotism,
nationalism.
belief in people who are atheists. Yesterday Bernie Sanders won the Nevada primary. If you're a devoted democratic socialist, that's in many sense your religion. That's where you get your sense of justice. That's where you get your sense, and
that's your holiday, which Jordan just won. So I'm saying, to answer your question, the question's already been answered. You have lower levels of religion in the United States, right? And instead, what happens is you have these pseudo-religions, not necessarily based on the idea of divinity, but based on a collective. And that comes back to the point of morals and ethics. I think that morals and ethics don't come necessarily from a higher being saying, hey, this is correct and this is wrong and I have the power to do everything, so therefore follow it. It comes from a mutual understanding, and that mutual understanding comes from, I guess, under a shared value. So Jack and the Beanstalk does bring us together, because even if I disagree with Jack and the Beanstalk and you agree with it, we both know what it is. So we have a point of contact. If you don't have communication, you have violence. So anything, literally anything, can become a source of binding. When I prefer a world where you have the source of binding being hobbies like skiing or nationalism or patriotism, and not necessarily a belief in the spaghetti monster.
And if I can just, before you guys jump back in, add on to that point, and also maybe further explain the point that I made earlier. I think the main source of disagreement, across the table right now is whether the supernatural is required to be a part of these, codes of belief or codes of values. And I'd say that it's pretty artificial, and you're almost viewing it from a very modernistic perspective to say that that's necessarily true. If you look back to ancient Greece, ancient Rome, the gods and all those stories behaved extremely immorally in most cases, and there was a huge division between the fates and the gods, what was the proper thing to do and what the supernatural said you should do. The fact that those two things became merged is definitely a historical phenomenon that we have to take into account, but I don't think it's impossible to separate them again. And like Jonathan just said, I think we already see that happening.
I just want to understand what you guys are pointing out, because it sounds like you're saying if you're appealing to patriotism and nationalism to derive justice from, like Prakhar and I assume would say that we're going to deify something, right? It's in our nature to deify something, but what you guys are subordinating yourselves to is then the state, right? So is that correct?
No, we have to ritualize something. You don't have to deify something.
We have to ritualize something, and we have to choose something to give value to. I think the burden.
But it sounds like
the burden of proof, I think, is on you to say why the supernatural necessarily needs to be an element of that. And I don't think it necessarily needs to be the state either. Political systems are an extremely common example of that. Mm-hmm. But someone who's like a committed humanitarian, someone who give up their life. There are plenty of non-religious people. Someone who behaves in altruistic ways, who does Doctors Without Borders.
So you would deify a living individual.
No, not deify. You would ritualize, hold to a higher standard. What do you think?
But ritualize.
Define deify. Do you mean like whole exalt, or do you mean like this person has omniscience and omnipotence?
What you're saying about ritualization, ritual is a behavior that we repetitively do collectively, right? It's a pattern of behavior.
To give meaning.
Deifying is to raise somebody up above the level or species that they're in.
Okay, so I don't think we have to deify in our situation, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. I think we do have to ritualize, because it allows for everybody to do everything at the same time. A ritual is a communal activity, and that community is at the very heart of what we call ethics, because it eliminates xenophobia.
Take Veterans Day. Veterans Day is a day where you honor people in the military. That doesn't mean you're deifying them. It means you're placing value upon them. And I think it's another conversation as to whether that value is arbitrary, whether it can sustain like philosophical inquiry into whether that really makes sense to give value. But I don't think you can necessarily say that just because it lacks the supernatural, it's somehow inferior. I don't stipulate to the vacuum that you're pointing out.
Can I answer that?
Yeah.
Right. So to steelman what you were saying, and tell me if I'm framing it correctly, it's like we can replace the vacuum left by God without assigning the value of God to somebody, but creating a community around them so values can be extracted and reality can be shared, right?
Ethics without religion.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So here's my argument as to why what you say is trivial, a difference, is absolutely the most important difference in success and failure. Almost all living people that you would, let's just use deify as a word, the operational word for what you meant. If you deify any living person, including Bernie Sanders, they will be seen as corrupt. Everybody's imperfect. The corruption is going to show. Always. Let me finish.
Sorry.
Right? The corruption is inevitably a failure, a weakness, a vulnerability is inevitably going to show. And that is if you are holding as, say, the ideal, like we do with Jesus, will not work well. On the other hand, if I take the collective ideal of everybody around me and then psychologically externalize it to a being who's supposedly always watching me, which is basically optimizing Freud's superego, the rule book for how I must behave has been codified, externalized so it's incorruptible, and then let govern my behavior. And here's the funny part. I think we do it with people like Gandhi and Martin Luther King too. They had their weaknesses, and Perry will speak to what Gandhi's weaknesses were. But as soon as they die, we sort of elevate their status to a semi...
Because they're infallible after death.
You have to do that so that the value that is present within those fallible individuals can be made infallible. That is the very process of codification of values.
Isn't that an argument in favor of us, though? I mean, I feel like that argument applies better to our side. If you're capable of deifying someone who's imperfect, like Gandhi, and saying that their value comes not from the fact that they were flawed, imperfect human individuals, but what they represent, what they stood for, specific actions they did, that seems like humans are capable of attaching value.
But the response would be that not as efficiently. These things have played out in the free market of deification for a long time, and the answers are pretty clear. You do not do it. Gandhi does not have temples. Gandhi will never have codes of conduct for people to behave in similarly when they're singing, and all those have a community-wide externality effect.
I'll capitulate to the fact that when you have a pseudo-religion based on an individual, and that individual is fallible, it might create for a less efficient community. So
Massively less efficient.
I don't think they are
However,
based on individuals.
But exactly. I don't think they are based on individual. Patriotism is not the idea that I'm a supporter of Trump because he's my president, but rather the idea that I support the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, it's an ideal that we ritualize, not deify.
I think it's sort of a false comparison. So I'll touch on this patriotism portion of it too. Patriotism, again, what you're doing is you're codifying your manner of behavior, the societal collective manner of behavior, and subordinating it to the will of the state in that position, right? Patriotism comes from the state, the state that you're born into. Now, that also expands xenophobia in that same sense of the argument. But what we were pointing at when it comes to deifying people that are alive, Gandhi's a good example, right? Gandhi had his own moral code of ethics, and they came from a higher being, somebody outside of him, right? Somebody incomprehensible, something that he could never be. And he admits to this, right? Now, and I also think it's very different from, say, honoring somebody on Veterans Day, right? Or even somebody that did some grand event, some grand action, and then we respectfully honor them even after their death. It still doesn't allow us to formulate a modus of behavior, right? A modus of action. What religion does is it allows for almost like a perfect level of ambiguity, where it's not something that applies black and white, right? And a lot of people read it this way, but if you just take one like small metaphorical interpretation of text, you realize that it's ambiguous enough where it applies across cultures, and it allows people to kind of formulate how they think they should act without realizing what the perfect action would be. So it's the best that you're able to do in the moment.
Just to add to that, I think what you guys are underestimating is the omnipresence of religion as to how many areas in your life and how deeply does it affect that. You cannot compete, you cannot fight dogs with elephants. The religion is the influence of religion is massive in comparison to what patriotism can seep into. It just is not made for
now. As it is now.
Yeah, I don't think you can fairly argue in favor of just the status quo there. And to the point about patriotism, I think maybe a better comparison, because I can see how patriotism has those same flaws and maybe isn't as easily like divisible. But take something like just like humanism, because I think the point about efficiency is kind of ironic because you're not accounting for all of religion's many inefficiencies. You know, if someone doesn't, first of all, the reason that someone doesn't murder someone is not because in the Ten Commandments it says, thou shalt not murder. There are many social reasons for that have absolutely nothing to do with religion. It's a reflection of that. It's not because of religion. You're reversing cause and effect. But I say that if people believe that human life is sacred because of their religion, and that affects, their policy and the ways they act, that is a reasonably efficient way to get that idea out there, but why not just make it the humanistic argument that human life is sacred because human life is sacred? Why does it need to be human life is sacred because God is sacred and because God made us in our image?
No. Well, you cannot tautologically, while you're making a case for the fact that we must establish some fact-based moral architecture, you cannot start the premise with a tautology. You cannot start it with a circular logic. Human life is sacred because human life is sacred does not work.
No, but I totally disagree with that because it's already a tautology. Human life is sacred because God happens to say human life is sacred is no less a tautology. It's just a hidden tautology.
And if you want to change the argument to say that human life is sacred because we are all, that's to say, in a sense, a mirror of one another, act the same way as one another, and so if I do not want to do something bad to you, it means I don't want to do something bad unto myself, the golden rule.
We are made in each other's image rather than God's
exactly.
image.
If we base it off of the idea that I don't want to do to Alex anything that I wouldn't want happen to me, that can be the origin.
It's Kantian.
It's Kantian, and more than that, I think that, have you guys read Yuval Noah Harari's book, Sapiens?
Yep.
Highly recommended, absolutely amazing book. He refers to the idea of this...
Graham Hancock, look him up.
Whatever, bro. So he refers to this idea that you can't necessarily be in a close relation with people that are, above 150 people. I can know very well about 150 people. I can be in constant contact with them. I can consider them my family unit. But after that, my mind sincerely doesn't have the capacity. What I need to do in order to treat others outside of my direct community well is somehow to believe that there are others outside of my direct 150-person contact that are like me in some sense. And that, I think, is the impetus for what we call religion. And that utility doesn't have to come from a supernatural. That utility of, mutual protection. If I see somebody else who's an American outside of the borders, or holiday, if I see somebody else on July 4th, I'll say, hey, happy Independence Day. Or essentially just connection and relation such that we can talk about the same thing and have the same sort of culture. That doesn't need to have a supernatural nature. And that is something that we need to have in order to be kind to one another past 150.
So let me unpack that really quick before we make the flip, because surprisingly we're already at 20 minutes. But
It felt like a long time.
one thing that I think you're grazing over is natural human behavior, right? We will other literally anybody because we don't know what their belief systems are. We don't know how they operate amongst each other. We don't know what their values are or principles. Now, we could say in a beautiful utilitarian world that we would value another human being just for the fact that they are a human being. And ideally, we would strive for that place. However, I don't think it's how people intrinsically operate. What they operate on is that is an other and that's dangerous. Okay, the danger component is something that's been removed from at least history today. But even 50 years ago, it's a very relevant conversation, right? And there are evolutionary principles as why we are constantly afraid of an approaching group that we do not know. But what religion allows us to do is identify, fundamentally they have this base level of belief. And this base level of belief, no matter where they come from, allows us to have a cohesive conversation.
But that's a limit. You're limiting it. And so what you have to do is then attack and say, convert to my particular religion or die by the sword so that I can continually increase the limit because I need to make sure that everybody's pure and has the same value system as me. I think religion is great for doing that in small microcosms. But if you really want to have an ideal where everybody treats each other well, you need to make a different system that doesn't have a cutoff line at, let's say, hey, these are the borders. We have to expand the borders so that we can basically purify these crazy barbarians. Mm-hmm. I think that the best way to do that is not have a system that's saying we need to have them believe like I believe, but rather we need to believe that everybody is of a certain standard. Humanitarianism, I think, is a great. Kantianism is a great system for that. Pushing that as an ideology, much how Confucianism does, or how certain forms of Buddhism does. That's beautiful. Now they take it to an area where it can maybe involve the supernatural, but it doesn't need to be involved in order to have that same utility.
Okay, so let's flip now.
Everything I said before was wrong. I'm an idiot.
God was dead. Now he's alive.
He's fucking alive.
Let's not tamper with the steel and the steel man.
Do you want to give
Let's start off where they began, right? So
Sure,
now we are advocating against religion or the utility of religion. You guys are advocating for it. You guys brought up numerous times the metaphorical element, right? So I think we could begin with God, right? Prakhar, let's go there.
Okay, so people think Dostoevsky said this, but this was actually Sartre. Sartre said, if God is not present, everything is permissible. But I, and frankly, Slavoj Žižek would like to make the opposite case. It is that it is only when God is present that everything is permissible. And the example to that is 9-11, right? It's really with the permission of a supernatural that you cannot and do not and will not and have not have a question with, that you will be doing anything with the promise, with the ultimate promise of what happens when the most uncertain event, the biggest fear of your life kicks in, death. If I tell you you're going to get whatever the fucking reward in hell or heaven or whatever the fuck you're planning to go to, I have the ultimate manipulation tool on you. Because once you understand cosmic time is far beyond your lifetime and you will die, existential angst, the very fact that keeps us sane, stable and on the ground, once I remove that element from your code, I can make you do whatever the fucking hell. And this is why it is in the presence of God that everything is permissible.
I would only expand that just a little bit because that's spot on, is that you can look anywhere in history where religion has been present and all of the atrocities committed were validated in the belief that you are doing this for a deity and that there will be a reward in the afterlife.
Okay.
So let's codify God real quick before we get into this. Are we saying God is like, long beard, the son of Jesus, all that stuff? Are we saying God in terms of a universal, supernatural being outside of our realm of understanding in the fourth dimension, so to speak? Those are two vastly different arguments.
Well, let's start. We'll just focus on the Abrahamic text for now.
Okay.
So, yeah, God in those
So the
sense.
original Abrahamic text in Judaism can be seen as the supernatural portion outside of the fourth
Let's
dimension.
not introduce complicated Judaism, just vague Judaism.
Okay, the Judaism that people believe is Judaism. Okay.
Yes, Netanyahu's
I-
Judaism.
First off, I just want to comment that I'm continually impressed by Prakhar's ability to name drop 4 different philosophers in one sentence, and then include
That's all I do.
and then include himself as one of those philosophers. So he shifted from the very technical language to just name dropping everybody.
And by the way, I'm also part of this group.
It's not my problem that you're dumb. I have to explain myself over and
It's
over.
not my
Ad
problem
hominem.
that you're insecure. Ad hominem, ad hominem.
Roasted.
But to respond to that, I think I would absolutely challenge that point. Especially looking at the 20th century, millions and millions of deaths from Stalinism, from communism in the USSR, which was explicitly atheistic. Millions of deaths from Nazi ideology in the Holocaust, which had religious elements to it. But the Nazis doing those crimes were absolutely not doing it because they thought killing Jews was going to give them a reward in the afterlife. They were doing it because of the idea of racial purity and the creation of the Third Reich here on Earth. So I'd say, absolutely, I would stipulate that religion can do terrible things and cause people to behave in extremely irrational ways, but I don't think that's a unique aspect of it. Yeah,
for sure. I think like a very important point is, and just to kind of codify this, the difference between in-group and out-group will happen regardless of what we assign it to.
Well, let's start with Soviet Russia, right? So the Gulag Archipelago is a fantastic text when it comes to just like breaking this apart. But what I think they did, and what Alexander Solzhenitsyn claims they did, is that they deified the state, right? So the secular argument pertaining to the 20th century, I don't think necessarily is a completely different example. I think it falls into the same train of thought. We deify something, right? We hold something above ourselves, an ideal, a philosophy, an ideology, and we subordinate all of our humanistic actions, all of our intrinsic desires for compassion and empathy to what the state demands. And that's absolutely what happened, I think, in Soviet Russia. Nazi Germany is also a good example because they deified an individual. They deified the word of Hitler, right? So these atrocities absolutely occurred, and both of them claim to be secular states. I don't think it was secular behavior.
I think you've changed your argument. Are you arguing against the utility of religion, or are you arguing against the utility of deification?
Okay, you know what? Let me try and simplify what he's trying to say, right? And let's move away from deification because that can act as a confusing proxy. Let's talk about more tangible things, certainty, which is what you brought up, right? The Nazi Germany was promised a certainty within this lifetime. They did not have to be promised something beyond this lifetime for which they did just horrible acts, right? This was the general argument from what I understand. And that is exactly my problem with religion, because what you do is you take this once in a century certainty that our wild imagination can allow us, codify it, embed it within the structure of society for all generations to come in its purest, most ultimate, most rewarding form. And I think there is nothing more dangerous than creating a possibility, a Trojan horse of Nazi Germany within every generation of every race.
I think this is where fundamental misunderstanding is coming from. You're looking at history in terms of the storyline from war to war to war to war, right? And we're forgetting all of those interim periods of complete and total peace. What about the peace that happened before? We were at one point when our tribe was 15, 20 people, we'd be fighting every night. You wouldn't know if you were sleeping at night, whether somebody would come from a different tribe and steal your kid and run away. If religion is, if anything, a utility, it expanded our tribe from a 15, 20, pseudo-primate group into a civilization. And whether, back to the case study of Hitler, you're using utility of deification, utility of religion, the reason why people supported him and elevated him is because he had essentially the same power that a god might have. With his words, he can choose life or death. He has the completion of your identity. So it wasn't that they were deifying him, he just had certain powers that were godlike, which is why I think they followed him blindly, out of fear and out of love.
And to go off of that, I mean, you see many of the people who defied Hitler in Nazi Germany did so for religious reasons. I mean, there were Catholic bishops who were trying to save Jewish children because they recognized that the value of the temporary value that Hitler may have over them in this world was nothing compared to the power that God would have over them in the afterlife. So I'd say, speaking of embedding that in future generations, I'd argue that religion acts as a safeguard. It says no matter what may happen in this mortal plane, if people recognize that there is a value beyond just what they see, it'll actually make sure that those morals stay embedded within them.
So in conclusion, let's stop looking at religion in terms of the extrema, the small population that use it for nefarious means, belligerent means. Let's look at it in terms of the vast majority of what religion does most of the time. And those are far-reaching psychological effects. I can go into them a bit in detail, but I know.
But I don't. So I think this is also a false analogy, because even like while those Catholic bishops were helping people in accordance to what their religion would demand, there are plenty of atrocities that Catholic bishops have incurred all throughout the history of Catholicism. Even and specifically to their own membership. But let's step away from that for 1 second and expand upon the actual utility that's provided on religion, right? So what religion says. Obviously, there's a significant vacuum on, like, say, the 10 Commandments, where you could just write one thing, which is do not rape or do...
That's not in there, by the way.
Yes.
They should have that in
Who knew? Do not own slaves, right? Now, that could have resolved many, many problems throughout human history, at least to the subsect of people that follow this ideology, right? Now, we think that religion may have resulted in those momentary things of periods of peace, but that could also just be other forms of progress, right? We've been collectively improving economically, right? Culturally, morally, all these things evolve outside of religion in spite of the religious tenets.
But here's the problem. That evolution is causing our detriment today. If you look at the amount of depression, the amounts of isolation that is happening in our modern day world, I think it's because technologically we've evolved past our biological means of understanding the world. Religion gave us, if anything, a ability to not be as distraught when somebody dies. Or even on the tiny things, we're talking Abrahamic religions, the idea that if this vase breaks, I say, kapara. Something worth was supposed to happen that didn't happen because this vase broke. Or the little things that you're ingrained with this dogma that allows you to be a truly happy people. If you look at the happiness levels in various people, in various religions, when you have meaning in your life, whether that comes from a particular career or from a devout religion, you essentially are able to become more self-actualized. And people that are happiest are religious people. I can look up a study real quick to justify that, but I'll let you respond.
In the meanwhile, I think the argument that since there are modern diseases at play that probably did not exist before religion had a decline is a non-starter, because what data do we have, and how much data do we have, and it's not just data about modern diseases like anxiety and depression, but were there other mental problems because there was something else that was there more repression, or was that leading to more neurosis? So we generally do not have the data, and I don't think that's a starter. But to answer this momentary peace argument that you're making, the momentary peace, I would say, is not occurring because the possibility of war has been smoothened. I think it is occurring because the people who would have otherwise started a war are silenced. And think about it like this: if we did not have modern means of reconciliation, whatever they might be, the LGBT population, or for that matter, anybody who's repressed in their identity because of religion, would be in some form or fashion a tribal war with us. So it isn't that religion's basically smoothing out the possibility, it's repressing the right of people to be themselves.
So just one caveat: the data that we do have comes from the Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz, the economist, and he's ranked Roman, Catholic, Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity, and Shiite and Sunni Islam. They have a very, very good set here with a vast population. So I think that it's been corroborated in the meta-analysis, and I think that for that reason, we can say with a certain certainty that religion does bring a sense of happiness.
I would have to look at that study. There must be so many places I can cut. And
Well, even challenging the happiness hypothesis, it's a different question whether or not religion contributes to happiness or the lack of religion is contributing to our ills, our cognitive ills in modern society. Very, because they could be coming from completely different places. You can absolutely find a sense of happiness in ignorance. You can absolutely become depressed strictly by the technology that we have today, Instagram and social media. I would also add that the idea that in the worst dire of circumstances, religion provides a level of comfort. The thing is, we're not exposed to the most dire, right? What we are is we're exposed to periods of uncertainty, of discomfort and fear. Now, in those moments, instead of taking the philosophical route of memento mori, which is the reminder of death, which creates a sense of urgency to live the best life you have because it's finite, you go in the direction of, I can start again, I can do it better next time, or that I can suspend these conversations that are absolutely meaningful because I will be reunited with this person at a later date. You can also justify the means of death, right? Now,
or you can get into performance, or you can just start like behaving disingenuously for the sake of an afterlife reward. Like, think about the corruption that happens. And that's what I mean. Let's ground this conversation because it's getting a little nebulous, and let's talk about the direct effect, psychologically speaking, of religion, which happens to every individual who comes across it. And most people do at a very, very young age. It's absolute repression. And from there, what can happen? I mean, Freud wrote an entire book called book on the I'm forgetting what its name, Discontents of the Civilization, and that had a lot to do with repression and neurosis. So, I mean, if you create a system that goes in direct opposition of what you meant by anxiety and depression, because that's still that hits you later in life and you're more equipped. This is attacking you at your most vulnerable. And I think that's a sincere problem with the structure of religion.
And there's the indoctrination portion of it too, which is again spot on. You don't choose the religion that you're born into. Actually, it's very rare. So obviously some people do, right? But the religion that you think is correct, that you abide by, was handed to you at birth. It's just a matter of rolling the dice of where you're located. Now, you happen to be born in the United States, or you could be born in Israel. You end up being Jewish, but that doesn't negate everything that's happening in India with Hinduism or China with Buddhism, right? So especially with susceptible young minds, that allows it to propagate because they don't have the choice of critically analyzing what these texts are telling them, right? They're just bred into it and then handed a way of believing.
I would argue that is the misuse of religion. Now, if you follow religion to its text, right? At least the Abrahamic religion to a degree, then what happens is when you're going through life, you'll have something to justify what you're doing when you're doing it. The misuse of religion is the dogma, don't question what you're believing. But the proper use is an alleviation of what's an innate psychological trauma from the chaos in the world. If you show a dog a magic trick, right? Now you see this coin, now you don't. Or if a rock hits a human being out of nowhere, the first reaction is to look up. Where did that come from? I need reason. I need to understand why the things around me are happening, why they're happening. That'll happen regardless. Now, if we can take that chaos, that disconnect, that an understanding of the world is chaotic, and essentially be able to use it for good, for combining people, then I think that's a positive utility. Now, you're saying that there's war, that there is dogmatic non-questioning, and so on and so forth. And I would argue that is the misuse of religion, the ideology, by individuals for whatever particular incentive they have.
If I can add on to that point and also speak, I think, directly to the point that Perry made about the arbitrariness of where you're being born. First off, just to make it clear in case anyone was confused, Jews can be born in other places besides Israel, United States.
Legitimate, not legitimate.
Although I suppose those two are the most common. But I'd say, secondly, that's not something that's unique to religion, right? Like, no one, I mean, you don't choose anything about your circumstances of birth. You don't choose whether you're born in a wealthy family with lots of opportunity or born somewhere completely impoverished. You don't choose whether you're born in any nation and have any kinds of different life experiences. You don't choose whether you're born in a happy household with two parents who love each other, whether you're born in an extremely fractious one. And frankly, you don't choose whether your parents are liberal or conservative or any other ideology they could force on you. So I'd say what's good about religion is that there's something inherently universal about it. And I agree with Prakhar that we should ground this conversation more. So the most common religious faiths, and really all religious faiths that exist to this day that have been propagated over the centuries, have something to say about permanence about what will happen to you after you die, what the meaning of life is, what the meaning of human life is specifically. And I'd say that actually encourages you to look beyond the narrowness of your human experience, because you can be born anywhere and you can live any kind of life, and that is a type of narrowness, but the idea is it brings people together. Because if you're born in America as a Jew, for example, as I'm just speaking from my own personal experience, Judaism teaches you the value not only of all the Jews around the world, but also of human life in general. It encourages you to look beyond the limited circumstances of your upbringing. Exactly.
So what you're essentially referring to is the sensation of awe. And what you're saying is, and tell me if you disagree, but it seems like codified awe from religion sort of grounds people in the grander understanding of the ways of the world. And
I think it's all, but I also think it's something about breaking out, because you talked about indoctrination and repression, and it's absolutely true. You know, for example, if you're born, you know, someone who's gay in an extremely religious Catholic home, that could have extremely negative effects on you. But by the same token, a belief in God, a belief in something greater than the limited circumstances might cause you to question, okay, why was I born in this extremely religious in this extremely religious household as a gay person? What is my meaning? What am I supposed to do with the life that was handed to me? So I think awe is a good way to put it. It's about looking beyond your own limited circumstances.
Right. And
but that's the entire enterprise of philosophy. Now, why would we pick religion, which cannot be updated, is codified in a text that's permanent, versus philosophy, which is a continuous conversation all throughout human history?
Also, religions can absolutely be updated. Continuous revelation is a part of, I'd say, most major religions, certainly Judaism.
And that's exactly what I think was Jonathan trying to do when he said, listen, you're looking at the wrong parts of religion to make the case. I don't think we're looking at the probability distribution of religion to make a case, while you were continuously indulging in the revisionist approach of updating.
So, we're speaking from at least, I can't speak for Alex, but at least from the Abrahamic religion that I understand the most.
Sure.
And in that sense, I think that, there's no progression or there's no questioning. It's something that's fundamentally against what I was taught as dogma from childhood.
I mean, but that could be exclusive to Judaism, because you guys have
But here's the case that I'm making for Christianity and Islam is, even in a case where somebody is brought up, and Alex said this earlier, where they are viscerally hurt by the dogmatic nature of religion, it is the dogmatic nature of religion that forces them to come to adversity and become better for facing that adversity. And that is another aspect of utility that it's unmet.
But I think that's just circular logic, right? So you approximate adversity based off the religion that you're in, because you're constantly challenging and questioning what you're being told as far as the doctrine of the religion is concerned. But then you have to find a way to validate it, right? So you're continuously updating a way to make sure that this text is right and is in accordance with my own intrinsic morality and the morality of society at large today. It's not happening because of religion. It's happening, you're trying to do it in spite of what the religious text is telling you to do.
But it is the religion that is causing you to do it, which means that religion, whether it's seen as you as good or bad, has a utility.
No, why not human curiosity? Why not the intrinsic desire to know?
Because when you're born in a preset state, and this, I think Jung talks about this a bit earlier, but he says that there are three types of people. There is the lamb, the lion, and the baby. Right, the lamb being the person who accepts the doctrination from childhood, the lion being the person who's rebellious constantly and says no as a contrarian at every single point, and the baby who simply accepts some, doesn't accept others, lives through life with constant curiosity. Now, if you do not have something put against you, if you don't have some sort of basic contradiction, something to evaluate, then you have no reason to move forward. I think what religion does is it gives you a yin to your yang. It gives you a set of beliefs for you to disagree, remodel, edit, whatever the case is for your own personal life. But you need that sort of understanding of what a value system may or may not look like in order to come up with your understanding of the world around you. Otherwise, we're all just monkeys shitting, eating, and spitting.
I think that kind of goes back to tie it back to an earlier point about the fact that lack of religion in the modern day, and we can question the causality, but that lack of religion has at least been associated with depression. It's not that you can't have extreme adversity because of religion. It's that adversity in and of itself actually causes you to have meaning in your life. I mean, Islam literally means struggle. It's literally a struggle with God, and that's
Israel also.
Yeah. Israel is also wrestling with God. Christianity, the fact that Jesus will continually forgive your sins, and that the first step to being a good Christian is to recognize that you have original sin and are flawed from birth. So I see the fact that secularism leads to this depression is actually because it's too easy. It's not because the fact that religion gives you difficulties, things to deal with, the fact that you have to wrestle with the fact that, for example, as a Jew living in modern day society, it's extremely hard to be properly observant. That's not something that in practice makes you feel bad about yourself. It's something that causes you to find the value in your life as you live it.
The only response, and I think it sort of works with the metaphor when you say that religion's the yin to your yang, the only adjustment I'd like to make in that is that this entire circle is not divided in half. It's basically yang with a little bit of yin, and the religion's the yang, and that's what it is. So when you mean this challenge that you need to survive, first of all, I'm quite surprised that is an assertion you can make without testing it, because I don't think that is the case. I don't necessarily
think what is the case?
That you definitely need something of a challenge of the nature of, hey, you have original sin when you're 3 to have a successful and happy life.
I don't think you need it. I think just to maybe clarify my point, you can respond more effectively to it. Human experience in and of itself is a challenge, and religion gives you an idea of the framework of that challenge, that you come from people who have been continually going through that challenge. It gives you a way to understand it. So the 3-year-old is going to feel bad about himself no matter what. It's not that telling him original sin is going to make him feel bad about himself. The 3-year-old will understand that he's imperfect, that he's not who he wants to be as he grows up and discovers his flaws as a human being. Religion gives a framework through which to understand that struggle.
And it forces you to have to make something of yourself to a degree, or at least interact with something. Somebody who goes through life without religion completely has no set, he can have an interior set of sort of an aspiration or a goal, but it's not as if it is ordained that he must have some sort of aspiration and a goal.
No, I think that's a pretty outlandish claim. I think that, again, is intrinsic to human beings. They will all strive for something more.
They will find something.
But also,
but they're not told that they have to.
Even the original sin argument. Again, like I don't agree. I'm actually staunchly on the other side of that, where it's introducing insecurity, it's introducing fear, it's introducing shame to a child that has basically this, endless amount of possibility in front of them. Now, absolutely, adversity is going to happen as a product of being a human being, but there are plenty of other ways to navigate adversity. Your culture, your tribe, your community, right? They all have narratives and stories of the different levels of adversity that they've faced. And again, it is necessary to experience adversity, but it's not necessary to continuously utilize this same outdated template when it comes to approaching that or what to do about it. Because I do think that that's harmful. And especially as society evolves, you can update that. You can improve upon that. You can find completely alternative modes of creating some type of methodological system that allows people to do something in life.
Free markets.
But here's the
free
thing.
markets. Let me pose. Can I
think
so here's the deal. I think I don't understand why we need such a cost-laden method of providing people an idea of a meaning at all. And what I mean is, would it not be natural, and if I invite you to think, to have an external sense of striving rather than this constantly elusive internal nebulous sense of striving with God? And I mean, as a society, we've been doing this, and should we not continue to build structure so people can find this adversity in a more safe, in a more secure fashion in the outside world, than go to the bottom of their misery that is and here's the deal. Say, let's run this thought experiment. If you're moving into the future, either adversity is going to increase outside or it's going to decrease outside. Those are the only two ways it'll happen. If it's increasing, why would you not let people find it outside? Then what is the point of capping it with? Let me finish. What is the point of capping it with religion? And if it's decreasing, which is truly the case, the fact that adversity is in gen, then why do we need to glorify this primitive concept of adversity if it's decreasing?
So let me answer that. For the collective nature of adversity. Now, I understand that you're saying you can get collective nature of adversity from culture or from society, and I'll approach that portion in a second. But just to your point, the reason why don't we just let them face the adversity they have in their own personal lives and derive meaning from that, is because there's a certain beauty that comes with facing a collective adversity that you wouldn't get. Now, that beauty can also be derived from culture and society.
Let me just clarify what I was saying. I wasn't saying personal adversity. I'm saying why not let it be a bottom-up phenomenon? Why do you have to impose that adversity when it can rise from the bottom? As me and Perry can get into a common adversity,
Yes, okay. So you're saying why can't it be a bottom-up adversity?
Right.
So we understand that collectively the adversity that's from bottom-up can be various different types of adversity.
And then we can pick and choose. Yeah,
right. So
it could operate in a free market.
So those various different types of adversity, I believe, will give you some sort of utility. But a collective adversity that is experienced by everyone gives you, I think, a far greater significant adversity.
But here's here's
Now,
the
whether
deal.
that adversity, yeah?
Here's the deal. I don't want your adversity. I want Parveer's adversity.
Sure.
Right?
You
So-
can have that. You can have your own adversity and your in Parveer's adversity. But I think there's something you get even more if you're facing a collective adversity. Now that can come either from questioning what your culture is or what your society is or whatever the case might be. But when you do that, then that frame of adversity is constantly changing in a sense where who is to say that the Mesopotamians didn't have their version of collective adversity and the Babylonians their version of collective adversity and the Greeks and the Romans and so on and so forth. Yes, society and culture does give you one frame to approach that, but really the only thing that can string all of that together and erase the cultural, societal, and state lines is a belief in some sort of higher being. The reason I believe... the reason I believe that you'll have Christianity alive today, even though you no longer have these societies or these cultures, is because there was something that was beyond debate, right? There was something that was intrinsic, a certain golden thread through which all of the cultures were wound together. And that is a belief in some sort of divinity. So I think that sense...
Let me just expand on what I was saying, because I don't think you touched on it.
Oh, sorry.
Adversity is going to happen, right? Everyone has adversity all the time.
Of course.
Even these larger scale adversities, because I absolutely agree with you that there's a book called Tribe by Sebastian Junger.
Tribe.
And it's a fascinating book, but he points to the fact that people are happier when there's massive cataclysms occur to their communities because they all bind together, they let go of their other bullshit, and now they have something in opposition to all of them, right? The fact is, it's not that you need to introduce this, right? A product of being a human being on Earth is this is going to happen. Even as prosperous as society here is today, we still have these looming fears and concerns, right? A cataclysmic event away from the extinction of the human species, right? That's its own adversity.
But you're connected to the status quo of the people within your generation.
So
the cataclysmic adversity of 9/11 that unified us, or the adversity that comes with the war and the Revolutionary War, that is generational.
Right.
That is to each person to its own generation. What allows a surpassing of a generation and a connection to the past, the future, and across culture and society is the belief in a divinity of sorts, a unquestionable origin of
here's the deal.
connection.
Prakhar, really quick. So we're well over the 20 minutes. Give us the last word and then we'll transition.
And this is where I'll finish, right? So when you say 9/11 and such are generational adversities, this is exactly what I meant by a bottom-up adversity phenomena, right? And this is exactly how religion was codified. There were bottom-up adversities. We wrote to a paper, sealed it in a book and threw it around. But the problem is exactly what you mentioned. These adversities are generational adversities. These are not intergenerational adversities. That bottom-up phenomena, because it was codified, it transmuted into a top-down phenomena. And that is why it needs constant updation. And all this energy could be avoided if we all sat down and came up with a more defined, more refined, a better version of something like Scientology. Like, we don't need to go that route, but there have been instances of modern revisions on brilliant, on absolutely historically brilliant religions that have worked pretty well. Mormons are a modern religion too, right?
Are we really ending the talk on the utility of religion by glorifying Scientology and Mormonism?
I'm glorifying
Is that where we came to?
It's the same argument I make for China, right?
It's the danger of Stoa people.
It's not like China is doing it right. It's the fact
correctly. It's China.
that they're making the case that you can do it a different way and still make the same gains. It's just basically, I'm not saying they're doing it right. I wouldn't ask somebody to go the China route, but it's just the case that there's an alternate.
I know we're over time. We're moving into open discussion now, right? Because I do have a response to that.
Okay, well, let's just start with this.
Sure.
So now we're going to move into this open discussion. And again, we're going to maintain this anonymity as to our actual position. So we won't say what we really think, but now this is an opportunity to explore nuance within conversations. You can absolutely respond, but there's a template that I want to try with this,
sure.
right? So the first one is, I'm going to pose a question. We feel like these religions won out as a almost like a political movement, right? It survived as a political enterprise, and then people constantly ensued war to make sure that their religion never died out. And we assume that, this is at least like the predominant secular argument as to why religion still exists today. The advent of science is also a relatively new phenomenon, but many people, obviously Jordan Peterson included, say that there are other elements and wisdom that has been attempted to be passed on from our earliest ancestors. Now, the Old Testament, we're not sure when it was written exactly and who wrote it, but for some reason it persisted throughout. Now, if we can, let's try and steel man an alternative reason why religion still exists today.
Oh,
I think we spoke about this a bit earlier, so I'm afraid to be redundant. I think it has to do with the fact that we need to connect intergenerationally and across cultures and societies. And religion is here today because our fundamental psychological state needs that form of frame, or that form of frame. Whereas we may have progressed technologically past that, the root, the skeleton of our personality, and this is just a conjecture, I think longs for something greater than themselves.
Here's what I'd say. Ironically, I think Richard, what I'd mentioned about memes before was not the internet memes. It was Richard Dawkins' concept, which what he was speaking about was how ideas ride upon genes, and those are called memes. And memes go through an evolutionary process of their own, right? So the case that I'm going to make is going to be along the naturalistic line of Isar. But here's the deal. I truly think religion is a very low-cost version of a massively profitable meme that got spread, and that is exactly why it outcompeted all other memes that tried to tie the same modalities of society together: politics, law, bloody social, or like all of that. And so the examples are sometimes very brutal as well, like the fact that the Christian Inquisition happened, or like the Middle East taken by conservative Islam. All that phenomena happening is essentially a meme asserting itself over other memes. And to think about the subtlety of how these memes operate on the efficiency scale, I've always said Islam is a very successful religion for that reason, because that meme is hyper efficient for two reasons. One, it constantly coaxes you to come in. Like, I've never met a Muslim friend who's not asked me to convert. Two, they sealed the door shut. If you leave, there is nothing you can do that will get you on the heaven list again. Right? It seals you in so bloody tight that it becomes a more efficient meme of propagation. And I think that is the reason. It's because it's one of the finest memes we've created ever.
I really agree with that point by Prakhar, and to respond to the point that Jonathan made before. Well, I'm going to challenge it a little bit. Don't worry.
Okay.
Just to respond to the point that Jonathan made before, talking about our need to connect intergenerationally, I think we need to go back to the very origins of religion. I think that's why religion is useful and has utility in the modern day. But I think high-minded ideals like that have nothing to do with the origin of religion. To me, the reason we have religion is because we have farming, because we had collective communities build, power structures build, where people needed to, that's why we see that with the divine right of kings throughout all of history. There's been an extremely close relationship between the way that government distributes power and the way that government mandates different religions. So I'd say that the idea of it being a meme it's not just a meme that exists in a vacuum, and I think this agreeing with the point that you said.
No, yeah.
Oh, yeah, it's a meme that's utilized by certain people to maintain power.
It's utilized by genes, essentially. That's the whole purpose of the meme, to be a host to the gene.
Let me expand on the meme argument, because I think a lot of people slip up when it comes to exactly what this is. So if you apply evolutionary principles to the brain itself, right? Evolution dictated how every other organ evolved. We can also assume that it dictated how the human brain evolved, unless you want to go into Stone Age theory and aliens and stuff. But so
tempting.
Our minds operate on these evolutionary principles. So that extends to how we operate societies. That extends to our personality, even, right? And fundamentally our behavior. I think one beautiful example of this is Jordan Peterson's biblical lectures, because it was the first take on say Adam and Eve in Genesis that I thought was absolutely profound. Now there's one way to read these texts as a literal interpretation, which I think is fundamentally limiting. But when you take the metaphorical interpretation and then apply evolutionary theory to it, what you get is Adam and Eve, right? For example, the reason that our eyesight is sharper than other primates is in direct response, we think evolutionarily, to snakes, right? We see better than other primates because snakes were our predominant predator, as well as birds of prey far in the sky. So we look out into the horizon to a better degree than other primates can. We think that our ability to see in color came in as a result of fruit, right? Which is the redness of the apple. It also dictates fertility, which is why women put red lipstick on their lips. Even the fact that...
Or when they blush.
Exactly. So even the fact that Eve was created from the rib of Adam, right? You can apply the hierarchical example, right? Of how people participate in a social dominance hierarchy, where women basically select for the top tier men, right? It's a hypergamous relationship. So women determine whether or not a man is going to succeed evolutionarily or procreate his genes or not, right? So that selective pressure means that most of what men do and how their behavior is adapted is obviously from our evolutionary adaptive period. What's that? EEG? EEA.
Evolutionary environmental adaptations.
And then even it extends today, right? So if you take this interpretation of Jordan Peterson's idea, and actually this is Carl Jung's idea of Genesis alone, there's a profound amount of information to be gathered. It's literally, it becomes a story of the emergence of consciousness, of when they woke up.
I'll cede to some of that, but I would just say that you can, if you're taking the text as a given that this text contains all these truths that you can tease out of it, to me that sounds like you're backwards engineering it.
Yeah, a little bit of intellectual gymnastics.
And it's not surprising to me that argument comes from, like an evolutionary perspective, because that's what, evolutionary scientists do all the time, is you see something in the fossil record, and then you explain backwards why that observed. It's not really true science.
Okay, here are two. Yeah, go ahead, John.
I just want to pose a question.
Before that, let me give you two very interesting evolutionary hypotheses as to why religion might have evolved. They're very interesting, and since you study biology, you might be able to appreciate that. One of the arguments is Robert Trivers, the very famous evolutionary biologist. His idea is that behind the root of all evolution of brain and mind that we have comes from the essential need to deceive. And that need to deceive comes from the need to self-deceive. And if you push that argument far enough to tell myself the truth, if I do it in a deceitful fashion, something like externalizing my ideal to a god, oh my god, that's profound, right? One. Two is an argument made by his student Brett Weinstein, and he made it against Richard Dawkins.
Shout out to Weinstein, we love you, we visited you, you're basically one of our greater influencers.
Yo,
if you see us, hit us up, we'd love to have you here.
That debate was profound because Weinstein takes 12 questions to lead Richard Dawkins on a trail of his own hypotheses. And one of the hypotheses Dawkins has is called the external phenotype, which is essentially five fingers are an internal phenotype. An external phenotype is a phenotype I have in the environment, like the beaver's dam, that is supposed to help me survive in my environment, against the selective pressures of my environment. And eventually, Weinstein asks Dawkins if he can consider religion being an external phenotype. Right? Because for us humans, for chameleons, right, when they move from surface to surface, they change color, they don't know. Humans, when they move from social group to social group, they change roles and they don't know. For us, quite literally, our true skin is our social interaction. And this could be the perfect external phenotype that we created to protect ourselves. And I think those two are brilliant evolutionary hypotheses for religion.
So I think we're presupposing one thing, and I think you said it earlier, and I think you take issue with it, that first came civilization, first came farming, and then came religion. But in actuality, if you look at our hunter-gatherer selves, we had various forms of religion as well. We came around the fire and ate the cooked meat, and we told each other stories, which is a form of religion itself. I think that we're a product of our current environment, our understanding of the world, because we have people like Weinstein and Dawkins and so on and so forth. But I pose a question. Let's try to think of this issue from the perspective of a larger scope of time. Not just the last 5,000 years of Abrahamic religion, but rather the last 20 to 25,000 years of humanity. And prior to that, even we can go into Neanderthals and so on. And so, yes, I agree that there is definitely an evolutionary benefit to thinking of religion as a reason for us to meet 3 times a day and be more unified, or thinking of religion as, hey, there's an afterlife, so we'll fight better in wars because we don't think that death is really death, right? Those are definitely good indicators for why religion survived till this day. But is it possible that religion, right, is justified because it has given us all of these beneficial evolutionary means, and in fact that there is a divinity to it, because if we hadn't have had that, then our particular group that believed in that wouldn't have survived till today?
Yeah, in that same conversation, it's a distinction between an empirical truth and a Darwinian truth. An empirical truth is something that you can say is a fact and get as close to a fact as you can.
Newtonian truth and a Darwinian truth, because an empirical truth can be a Darwinian truth too. Like you can empirically. Really? So for instance,
can we explain all of this to our viewers?
Right. So a Darwinian truth is something like treat the gun like it's always loaded, right? It's an empirically accurate observation, because if you look at the data for the number of people who shot themselves or somebody else because they didn't care to check if the gun was loaded or not, or if they were not on safety or something like that, that's a fucking lot of people. They should have been smarter.
And it allows for people to fight vigorously in war.
Right?
knowing that death might be imminent.
Right? And on the other hand, a Newtonian truth is something, it's the same thing that I started off that you claim to not understand because my English was too Victorian for you all. It's the difference
Take
between
a
what
joke,
is.
take a joke.
No, of course. What is and how to respond to it. Right? So what is a gun could or could not be loaded. That's the Newtonian part of it. The Darwinian part of it is treat it like it's always fucking loaded. You don't want to fuck up along those lines. So that is the fundamental difference between the way we communicate truths now, which is in this is, versus the way we communicated truth back then, which is this is how you must behave because we don't know what this is.
And I think to go off of that and to respond to the point that Jonathan made earlier, I think it's a fair critique of what I said earlier to say that yes, religion preceded, agriculture or the creation of like large civilizations. But I think that's exactly the point, that those earlier beliefs were extremely practical. They were about explaining like naturalistic phenomena we did not understand and creating like a group of, like extremely vulnerable, cavemen essentially, or extremely vulnerable hunter-gatherers in such a way that they could survive. Okay. Once that religion becomes codified into a power structure, that's when I think you can properly call it religion. Before I wouldn't even call it religion, I would call it like the folk beliefs.
Okay, I mean, this would be a good segue into a speculative question. And my question is this: now that we understand that religion had massive utility, at least back in the day, and every passing day there is a depreciation to its value that we face because, for the number of reasons, and especially what Alex just said.
I disagree that it's a progression, because if you look at, for example, the barbarian takeover of Rome, or even right now what's happening in the Middle East, religion is very prevalent and growing in those areas. So we can't say we're always progressing. I think
No. I'm saying there is a depreciation with every passing day to the utility of religion in our modern times, right?
I would take issue with that.
So there is sort of some, at least very visibly, there is some dead weight we are carrying that we need to jettison for us to move safely with the idea of the meme of religion. That would be the proper upgradation of religion. Let's just say we were tasked with writing the Bible anew, right? How would we create, or what algorithm would we create to sort through what to keep and what not to keep?
So wait, let's first define our metrics, because earlier you said that Islam is a very successful religion because there's a lot of growing population.
On the scale of efficiency.
I think we should measure successful religion not on the scale of efficiency of indoctrination, but rather on the quality of the ideas coming out, at least in Judaism, for example.
If I can respond directly to Prakhar's idea of dead weight, I feel like what you're not taking into account there is exactly how imperfect people are, and the idea that what the reason that people value religion is because of many of those inefficiencies. The point that Perry raised.
Are you saying that people value Islam because of 9/11?
Exactly. Yes. Exactly.
No, I mean that on a serious level. Like
no. Let me bring it back to the point I was trying to make earlier. When Perry brought up earlier the idea that the snake is present in Genesis because of like our primalistic fear of snakes, the reason that dragons, for example, the mythology, the folktale of dragons exists in cultures, in the Americas, throughout Asia, and in Europe, cultures that did not have extreme contact with each other, there's a prominent theory that's because our most primal fears built into our genes are snakes, big cats, and birds, and dragons combine those three fears, and that's where those fears come from. In the same way, I'd say a reason that religion arises independently is because of a psychological need to be watched, a psychological need for approval from like a father figure. That's why the idea of God as a father or a parental figure is present throughout many different faiths.
No, you can hedge that, and I agree. So the way I would frame that is that because reality and my action to reality is on a massive random scale that I can never determine, I need some sort of proof that what I'm doing is correct or incorrect. I need some sort of guidance to what is permissible and what is not.
My main point was, if you try to make religion more efficient and increase its utility for the modern age, you're going to take away the very reason that people engage in religion in the first place.
Which is the inefficiency.
Which is many of those inefficiencies, is the irrationality of believing that there's a big daddy in the sky who's watching.
No. Wait,
let me just expand.
By the way, Big Daddy in the Sky.
Big Daddy in the Sky.
FYI,
God Daddy. Let me just expand on that, because to me that it's such a fascinating question. We create this ideal, and if you want to define God as this ideal to hedge yourself against or to constantly bounce off what you're doing, it gives you the opportunity to constantly transcend who you are, right? To continuously make a better choice. And the observer aspect of it, I think, is actually key when it comes to religion. The fact that in the solitude and isolation of our own mind, we can do anything. When nobody's watching or holding us accountable, we can lie, we can cheat, we can steal, we could take a weaker path. But if there is this higher ideal that we
Santa Claus,
that we continuously hold ourselves against, even when no one's looking, it forces you to be better. Then it's codified in behavior. Then it becomes who you are. But I think if you extract this metaphysical component of religion, I think you are really missing out on the benefits that can be given through
And
religion.
I'm not making a case for us discarding the metaphysics of religion. Let me be very clear. There is certain, say, like the dogmatic aspects. You could localize within the text certain places where dogma has been reified, where dogma has been emphasized, and you can sort of alter them. There is enough places, if you look and if you're honest, I think honest enough about it, there is enough places where you can be like, oh, this. So, for instance, the LGBT or adultery, the stuff we have against that could be deadweight that we can drop, right? And I like the argument that we have this voyeuristic need for somebody to look into our behavior because it's reasonable. I'll tell you from a very psychological place. Yes, it is this need to confirm whether how I'm acting against uncertainty is whether. So that's why we stick to averages, because everybody does that. I can do that. Is because I sort of have empirical validation of this nature. But we have very solid alternate means to provide that have arisen almost bottom up if you take history long enough. And one of them is the evolutionary scape, which is sex. Essentially, you can create this undeniable negotiator of validation in the other sex, and you must behave a certain way to get their good wishes, or engage in sexual.
You can say sex.
And yes, and on the other hand, there is markets, right, which is basically law of large numbers. You have to be a certain way to sell your product. So we have modern metrics of assigning the same kind of validation, and whatever those validatory checks that are deadweight can be removed and can then be injected in these other paradigms to sort of supplement. And this is like a very utopic question. You have to understand. I'm talking about speculative utopia. How do you optimize religion for 2050?
Yeah. I think this entire time we've been talking about justification for religion or utility for religion because of the benefits and how we can improve those benefits, how we can take those away. Can we start thinking about maybe religion is religion because there is truth to it? Now,
I'm not denying.
No, so I'm trying to say is, I believe, particularly within my religion, because my justification of what God is different from what the norm. It's not necessarily a big daddy in the sky, shout out. And it's not necessarily the benefits that it comes to my future self. I think that if you look at various forms of knowledge, particularly, let's say, Euler's identity, e to the I tau. For those of you who don't know, Euler's identity is derived from a Taylor polynomial expansion, a bit of Calc 4. Where you take E.
Nobody knows what that means.
Okay, so essentially there's a formula that's created from sheer logic that's just in the brain that says that E, a logarithmic function, to the exponent I, which comes from imaginary numbers, tau, which is half of pi, which is 2 pi, sorry, what comes from geometrics, together is equal to 1. Now these are three separate things that have evolved independent of whether it's beneficial or not beneficial to us from sheer logic games, from mathematics. Now that is incredible. That shows some sort of invisible hand. These are three things that come from areas that are not supposed to be connected that somehow make one, and is then applicable to a various number of proofs, of math proofs. So if I cannot, cogito ergo sum, right? Let's go back to Kant. If I cannot prove that Perry really exists, and Perry cannot prove that I really exist, because I don't know if Perry is actually a figment of my imagination or in a matrix, then what is real? Right? The only thing that I believe is truly real, and I don't want to go too much into solipsism, but the only thing that is truly real is that of which I understand within my own mind.
Sure.
A rectangle is a rectangle because it has 4 sides. If I play with that idea, eventually I'll get to tau. Mm-hmm. Same thing with the other exponents. Mm-hmm. These things have no connection to one another, but somehow make one. And in physics, you can find this all the time. An understanding of how the universe works, right? That, in a sense, is a sort of worship to the way we are supposed to be, the way things are actually. Religion as terms of a explanatory force of what we are here. And I think that can be found, if that's my definition of religion, in folk religion, in modern religion, in science, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, so, I mean, there are plenty of things, plenty of fascinating directions that just opens up, right? It could be an extended phenotype to look for God, to seek God. We're looking for a God particle. We could be looking for some math equation that explains the universe. Dissonance. I mean, yeah, that too. And it's so complicated because even if you were to use sex as a metric, I mean, I think there's a valid case to be made that you could, subordinating promiscuity might be better for you in everyday life rather than just using that as a metric of gauging society. So the complexity of even like substituting one thing in place of religion is fascinating. So, I mean, that's time. I have one... No more. I object. No, last question. And Alex, you have a minute to do this. I want you to steelman Mormonism.
Ooh la la.
Steelman Mormonism.
Steelman Mormonism.
You go in 5, 4.
Oh, you piece of shit.
3, 2, 1.
Go. All right, so the reasons that I think that Mormonism is superior to any other faith, and no, I am not stalling for time just by using that.
I was hoping it would appear to me.
As I'm saying this sentence, I'm realizing what I think.
I think there's something to be said for the fact that religion should tie to the land where people came from, and that the more distant you get from the root of a religion, the more opportunities it has for perversion. There's something really bizarre about the idea that the Catholic Church located in Rome, which was the original persecutor of Christians, is now, according to the Catholic view, that's like the original church. That's where, the direct descendant of Peter, chosen directly by Christ, the representative of the church, that's where he lives. And I think one of the most, at least appealing things about Mormonism is that it grounds it for American Christians exactly where we came from, and says that the idea of what was the term you used to describe not monotheism but monism. Yeah, monism. God is one. God is everywhere. And so for Christians in the New World, especially when
20 seconds left.
Especially when Puritans were coming over to America. They were viewing it as a completely virgin, uncharted territory where God hadn't been, and the people here were just savages who had no relation to Christ. And Mormonism said, no, that's exactly wrong. God was here before us. God will be here after us. God is everywhere.
Location. It's all about real estate.
Location.
Okay.
Geographically
Right.
desirable.
Wait, before we sign off, I want to make an appeal to the public if possible.
Please.
Yeah.
Donate for us.
Listen,
Give to Israel.
we have a problem in our modern generation where we no longer know how to communicate with one another. We are constantly on our phones, constantly trying to, we have access to all of these people in all these situations, so we don't necessarily have the time to sit down and talk to one another about the things that are actually important. Instead, we talk about the weather, or about what Jenny wore yesterday, or about how am I going to get into this club. That's all bullshit. If you guys really want to actually have a deep conversation, understand the person in front of you, so you can have a relationship with someone that doesn't end when that person has a better thing to do that night, I would recommend following this method, because at least for me personally, it's brought me so much meaning. So think about that.
Yeah, I mean that's a beautiful place to end. So, if you guys have any feedback, if you have any suggestions, if you have topics that you want to hear, if you have a means of updating this, because again, as we say many times, this is an experiment in having a conversation. We don't know what the best way is. This is one way that we found, and it seems to work great. Follow us on social media, like our stuff, share this if it's appealing to you at all. If you hate one of us,
make memes, make lots of memes.
Ad hominem isn't allowed during the conversation, but afterwards it's encouraged.
Please don't forget to subscribe to the podcast. The subscribe button is right on top of your app screen.
We have to say that now.
Wait, do we do this? Do we do this thing? Or do we it come?
We'll put it
We don't know how to edit as well yet.
We'll put it right here. Okay, thanks guys.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.